Welcome to the Thought Dakota's YouTube channel. My name is Sean Mixer. Here, I try to show you the application of logic and try to show you, teach it within context of actually using it to analyze different arguments, different reasoning patterns, etc. Today, we're continuing our study of Dr. Jordan Peterson's biblical interpretation, his psychological significance of the Bible, and we want to dive right into some of these videos where we picked up last time. So Dr. Peterson has been explaining why it is that he thinks scripture is psychologically significant. He's pointed to the effect of the biblical text, the Old Testament, New Testament, the effect of it on Western society. He's pointed to this some type of aspect of humans' activity to whereby we get ideas and information from this place that he called the dreamlike state. It seems to be similar to what Carl Gustav Jung called the collective unconscious, what Freud called the unconscious. Jung believed that there was a correlation between everyone's unconscious because some of his patients were drawing symbols and describing symbols that he had read about in mythology, and allegedly they hadn't studied those symbols and ideas themselves. So he saw this as evidence that the unconscious mind was connected between other human beings. So we're going to continue this and see what Dr. Peterson has to say, and then we'll give some commentary and analysis, and within parts that seem to be important.
How does that make any sense? First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. I mean, there is the odd lucid dreamer who can, apply a certain amount of conscious control, but most of the time you're laying there asleep and this crazy complicated world manifests itself inside you, and you don't know how. You can't do it when you're awake, and you don't know what it means. It's like, what the hell is going on? And that's one of the things that's so damn frightening about the psychoanalysts, because you get this both from Freud and Jung. You really start to understand that there are things inside you that are happening that control you instead of the other way around. There's a bit of reciprocal control, but there's manifestations of spirits, so to speak, inside you that determine the manner in which you walk through life, and you don't control it. And what does? Is it random? There are people who have claimed that dreams are merely the consequence of random neuronal firing, which is a theory I think is absolutely absurd, because there's nothing random about dreams. They're very, very structured and very, very complex, and they're not like snow on a television screen or static on a radio. Like, those things are complicated. And then also, I've seen so often that people have very coherent dreams that have a perfect narrative structure. They're fully developed in some sense. And so that just doesn't, that theory just doesn't go anywhere with me. I just can't see that as useful at all. And so I'm more likely to take the phenomena seriously and say, well, there's something to dreams. Well, you dream of the future and then you try to make it into a reality. That seems to be an important thing. Or maybe you dream up a nightmare and try to make that into a reality, because people do that too if they're hell-bent on revenge, for example, and full of hatred and resentment. I mean, that manifests itself in terrible fantasies. Those are dreams, then people go act them out. These things are powerful, and whole nations can get caught up in collective dreams. That's what happened to the Nazis. That's what happened to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It was absolutely remarkable, amazing, horrific, destructive spectacle. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union.
Okay, now here he just mentioned collective dreams. That's an interesting that he would use collective to describe dreams, because as we just mentioned, Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, and now collectively people in larger groups, Dr. Peterson is claiming, have these dreams together. Uh, it seems like, are there really collective dreams, or is he using dream here to mean? Uh, is he equivocating again, basically using dream to mean something different from what he's previously been meaning it to, uh, using it as? It seems like when he says that an entire country, a nation, can have a collective dream, that means that the nation can have a, like, a collective goal, like a goal to annihilate one group of people, such as Nazi Germany, etc.
Same thing happened in China. It's like, we have to take these things seriously, and try to understand what's going on. So Jung believed that the dream could contain more information than was yet articulated. You think artists do the same thing, like people go to museums and they look at paintings, Renaissance paintings or modern paintings, and they don't exactly know why they're there. I was in this room in New York. I don't remember which museum, but it was a room full of Renaissance art, great painters, the greatest painters. And thought maybe that room was worth $1 billion or something outrageous, because there was like 20 paintings in there, so priceless. And the first thing is, well, why are those paintings worth so much? And why is there a museum in the biggest city in the world devoted to them? And why do people from all over the world come and look at them? What the hell are those people doing? One of them was of the Assumption of Mary, beautifully painted, absolutely glowing work of art. And there's like 20 people standing in front of it looking at it and think, what are those people up to? They don't know. Why did they make a pilgrimage to New York to come and look at that painting? It's not like they know. Why is it worth so much? I mean, I know there's a status element to it too, but that begs the question. Why do those items become such high status items? What is it about them that's so absolutely remarkable? Well, we're strange creatures. So I was trying to figure out in part, well, where did the information that's in the dream come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, and you could think about it as a revelation. Because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge and it's a revelation. You didn't produce it, it just appears. But that's, see, one of the things I want to do with this series is, like, I am scientifically minded and I'm quite a rational person, and I like to have an explanation for things that's rational and empirical before I look for any other kind of explanation. And I don't want to say that everything that's associated with divinity can be reduced in some manner to biology or to an evolutionary history or anything like that. But insofar as it's possible to do that reduction, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to leave the other phenomena floating in the air because they can't be pinned down. And in that category, I would put the category of mystical or religious experience, which we don't understand at all. So artists observe one another. They observe people and they represent what they see, and they transmit the message of what they see to us, and they teach us to see. And we don't necessarily know what it is that we're learning from them. But we're learning something, or at least we're acting like we're learning something. We go to movies, we watch stories, we immerse ourselves in fiction constantly. That's an artistic production. And for many people, the world of the arts is a living world, and that's particularly true if you're a creative person. And it's the creative, artistic people that do move the knowledge of humanity forward, and they do that with their artistic productions first. They're on the edge, and the dancers do that, and the poets do that, and the visual artists do that, and the musicians do that, and we're not sure what they're doing. Like, we're not sure what musicians are doing. What the hell are they doing? Why do you like music? It gives you a deep intimation of the significance of things. And no one questions it. You go to a concert, you're thrilled. It's a quasi-religious experience, particularly if the people really get themselves together and get the crowd moving. There's something incredibly intense about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an easy thing to understand. Music is deeply patterned, and patterned in layers, and I think that has something to do with it, because reality is patterned and deeply patterned in layers. And so I think music is representing reality in some fundamental way, and that we get into the sway of that and sort of participate in being, and that's part of what makes it such an uplifting experience. But we don't really know that's what we're doing. We just go do it, and it's nourishing for people, right? I mean, young people in particular, Lots of them live for music. It's where they derive all their meaning, their cultural identity. Everything that's nourishing comes from their affiliation with their music. It is part of their cultural identity. So that's an amazing thing. The question still remains, where does the information in dreams come from? And I think where it comes from is that we watch the patterns that everyone acts out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representations of those patterns. That's part of our cultural history. That's what's embedded in stories, in fictional accounts of the story between good and evil, the bad guy and the good guy, and the romance. You know, these are canonical patterns of being for people, and they deeply affect us because they represent what it is that we will act out in the world. And then we flesh that out with the individual information we have about ourselves and other people. And so it's like there's waves of behavioral patterns that manifest themselves in the crowd across time. The great dramas are played on the crowd across time. And the artists watch that, and they get intimations of what that is, and they write it down and they tell us, and then we're a little clearer about what we're up to. You know, like a great dramatist like Shakespeare, let's say, we know that what he wrote is fiction, and then we say, well, fiction isn't true. But then you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's true like numbers are true. You know, numbers are an abstraction from the underlying reality, but no one in their right mind would really think numbers aren't true. You could even make a case that the numbers are more real than the things that they represent, right? Because the abstraction is so insanely powerful. Once you have mathematics, you're just deadly. You can move the world with mathematics. And so it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction because it takes what the story that needs to be told about you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you, and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again. And at the end of that process, it took God only knows how long. I think some of these stories, they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as this. They stay the same. That's the answer. So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively.
So Dr. Peterson here, he goes to answer the question, where does the information in dreams originate from? And then he says he believes the way it works is that human beings have been making observations about other people, that artists and dramatists and poets and philosophers, actors, all the creative types have been representing human nature, representing people. That the most ancient texts take these abstractions and then they abstract on top of the abstractions, and this is done over time for many and many times until you get to some type of distilled representation of what humans are up to, as he says. He also brings up this idea that perhaps fiction can be real in the same way, or he says true in the same way that numbers are true, which is a weird way to say. It's weird. It's something weird to say that numbers are true. Then he says, well, numbers may be more real than and then the things that we abstract them from. But that's to take a position on the ontological status of numbers. I'm not sure if he's aware of that. If they're abstractions, then that means that's a type of conceptualism or psychologism, if I'm getting that correct. That we invent the laws of logic, and that they come from our heads and our imaginations or whatever, like fiction does. And he's putting numbers on the same plane as fiction, which I believe many mathematicians probably would disagree with that. But he went on for quite some time and didn't get to go to the next step. Okay, well, where does the information come from? He said, when people observe, people represent their experience through art. Uh, the most ancient text he believes is abstraction of abstraction of abstraction of abstraction over time. He doesn't provide any evidence for that, but he just makes that claim, and that seems pretty important to him specifically, since he's discussing the psychological significance of the Bible. But let's continue. Maybe he'll get to it in a second.
Unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, you know, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction, it's something that you act out, you know? That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play, is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that, they're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to, and that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean, and how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of? It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do. Not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why, but that seems to be the situation. So we act, that acting is shaped by the world, that acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories, we model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, well, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky or Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well, without the cornerstone that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. You know, the people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or, you know, intelligent, clear thinking, rational, scientific people. And I don't believe that for a moment because I don't think there's any evidence for it. I think we would become so irrational so rapidly that the weirdest mysteries of Catholicism would seem positively rational by contrast. And I think that's already happening. So,
Okay, was a natural pause. He kind of rushed into it. I don't know if you caught that, but he was like, so let's just do a quick recap. He could have said this in a lot shorter terms and go to more into like a proof or argument for it. But I guess he's avoiding just coming out with it because maybe he doesn't have any evidence for it. Hate to say that, but I mean, because what he said didn't seem related to anything he said prior to it. So he said that human beings, we observe other human beings, and we've been doing this as long as humans have had a nervous system, which he says is millions of years. Humans begin to represent the other humans that they experience through art, through poetry, through acting out, and et cetera, et cetera. The scripture over time is some type of abstraction of abstractions. Once you represent human nature in art, you are abstraction, that you create an abstraction. Uh, Once you abstract on the abstractions and do that repeatedly for over a long period of times, this is what he believes that the Bible does. His next step is to say that some knowledge is built into our bodies. It was like dance, like when we see a person dancing, that we can dance with them, and this is built into our bodies. I think this is what epistemologists would call know-how. It's knowledge of how to do something. It's different from knowledge of what. It's different from propositional knowledge as such. Then he just comes out and says that dreams get their information from our stories. Uh, so just stopping, he didn't provide any evidence from that, but he just says dreams are collecting information from our stories, which is like, ontologically speaking, dreams would seem to need to be some type of conscious agent or a computer like that is gathering information. But I don't know what it means to say that a dream gets information from a story, because the dream is not there unless you're like having it, right? Does he think this dream exists outside of us having a dream, and that it's observing our stories? Like it's interesting how he's putting this in language that suggests some type of agency for a dream. It's kind of like many evolutionists describe evolution in terms of a personal agent of sorts, a designer. Like evolution chose, this quality from this group of animals, and then they were able to develop this, and evolution caused them to, this desire to survive, to live, cause different effects in different animals. So I wonder about that. He also mentioned that when we if we can read the Bible and figure out what these stories are about, that's interesting, because the way he reads scripture doesn't seem to always align to what those stories are actually about. Uh, the common sense, obvious meaning of what those stories are actually about. I've heard him give like psychological significance to certain passages where Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, and he said it was expressing the psychological truth that if you're afraid of something, then you must face your fear in order to move past it. Uh, but that's not what that wasn't apparently what that story was about. So his interpretive method seems to be more subjective than to be objective. Seems like he's reading scripture in a way to where he's creating the meaning of scripture apart from the obvious meaning of the words of scripture. Finally, he says that the Bible can provide information about ourselves. And what he means is that information about the way human beings have functioned across time, how we have, how human beings act. Even he may have suggested some moral knowledge about that we can derive from Scripture about how human beings should act based off of the abstractions that the Bible writers or collectors and compilers or whatever he thinks have put the Bible together. So let's continue further into this.
Okay. So this is the idea, essentially, that you have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is because it might be a tragedy that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself.
Okay, looking at this picture here, it looks like we see two circles, well, a couple of circles, like several circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 circles. Two images on one image on each side. You got the spoken in the center, the dreamed, and then the acted. On the right side, you have the articulated, imagistic, and procedural. So it seems like, so I guess what's spoken is articulated. The dream is connected to the imagination, and whatever you act, there's a procedure for it. So I'm not sure what the connection is between these two diagrams. And he didn't seem like he explained it. Seemed like he just showed it and continued to speak over it. But let's continue.
And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And that's really worth thinking about because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents, it's your unconscious assumptions, it's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you, and it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question. That's part of self-realization, We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, why did you do that? You come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it. You're flailing around in the darkness. You try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that. And you're just way more than you can handle. And all right, so you act things out, right? You act things out. And that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out, and you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action. And then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology and literature. And there's a tremendous amount of information in that. And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. He's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time and getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain and he has this tremendous revelation sort of in the sight of God, and it illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert. He was continually mediating between people who are having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says, look, this is already basically what we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And like that's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story. But obviously that happened because we have written law, right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that, right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen,
So this was an interesting development here. He says that we have actions, we imagine our actions, then we translate those actions into the dreamlike state in a way. So it's some type of process here, which seems to uh, correlate to his view of abstraction. Then he talks about Moses went up to the mountain to get to make peace, and he says, "Well, what is peace?" Moses has to figure this out. Then he says, "Well, peace is whatever it takes to get peace. That's what peace is." And I don't know if that's true because what if it took murdering the majority of people in a village to make peace? Does that mean that murdering 50 people is peace? Those don't necessarily seem to be the same thing. What it takes to bring about X and X aren't necessarily the same thing. So that's a bit of our logic practice. So let X be anything for all X. If it takes Y to bring X about, uh, then it does not follow that Y. It's not the case that Y is X, right? They're not identical just because there's a correlation between them. It's like a cause and effect, right? Just because the cause to bring about some effect is not identified with, is not the same thing as the effect itself, right? Uh, I guess it depends on whatever you're considering, but specifically peace, that doesn't seem to work for peace.
you act out the body of law. And the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful, dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that. And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? Like, that's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding.
So I think this is an interesting point. Dr. Peterson wants to say that in order to make peace, you got to know what peace is. So what's the principle? But this body of law that Moses brings down is a group of principles, and that's basically what the Israelites meant when they meant God. That's odd because it seems like that the Israelites thought that God was a person. I mean, he spoke, he communicated. Uh, uh, he had abilities. He made causal effects in the world. He had certain expectations of the Israelites in terms of their behavior. It seems like so what they meant by God was a person, like a personal agent. They didn't think that God was a group of laws. He was identical to the laws. No, these were his laws. They came from him, uh, apparently in scripture. Now it's interesting. The next step is because Dr. Peterson wants to say that human beings begin to abstract from the good people that they observed, or the people who embodied certain principles, and they took 10 of them. He said you can take 10 of them, and so who's the best out of those 10, and take those best, and who's the best out of those, and who are the possible, then keep abstracting, and who's the best possible, and until voila, you arrive at something that's perfect through this process. Uh, Let me say one thing about that, because it seems like if we're really taking scripture seriously, as Dr. Peterson said he does, the Israelites don't obey the law, right? And they are told that the I mean the nations around them don't follow God as well. And God reveals himself to the Israelites and they don't follow God. So what does that say? Does that say that human beings have these principles that they built up to them? That human beings created these principles that they cannot even live by? Wouldn't that be uh, weird? Or does it show that there is a sense in human beings of a divinity that the human beings fail to live up to, which is more germane to the doctrine of sin in human beings, that there's something deficient in us, that we have this conscience, this sense of right and wrong, but even though we have this sense of right and wrong, there's still something that inhibits us from pursuing the evidence, the excellence of the virtues that we find within. So I think that Dr. Peterson has not adequately accounted for this aspect of human nature, because not only uh, did the Israelites receive the law, the principles, the body of knowledge, but the same scripture that he's interpreting says that they didn't follow it. So how does he account for this? Does this mean that humans generally don't follow what they know to be right? And then how does he explain that? If he's trying to say that there is this sense of right and wrong, a question that humans ask that other animals don't ask, why would we ask a question and not follow it through? Why should we ask how should we live, and then not live the way we invent that we should live? It seems as though by experience that what human beings do is they have a sense of right and wrong, and either they rebel against that sense of right and wrong, or they reinterpret it and say, well, really the wrong is right and right is wrong. And this is what I think is more aligned with our experience and with history. So I just wonder what how Dr. Peterson is taking this feature, this aspect of the very evidence that he's using to support his point, that this is an abstraction, that this what this is. So let's continue.
Principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle, and we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal, and it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay, because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning and properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. We're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstracted ideal that we formalized as God. But that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important. So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else, subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the
So we see here he's going back to an interpretation of divinity in terms of a principle, a way of acting, a rule for living. It's funny because he wrote a book. I think it's called 12 Rules for Living, or 12 Rules for Life. So in his view, that the God, the divinity, would be what directs human behavior. Just as a way of a backstory, Dr. Peterson describes himself as a pragmatist. You know, whatever works is what true, and he sees the influence of science as leading him to this view of epistemology. But it's interesting because he is disqualifying or not including God as a personal agent. And he has this concept that you build up to God you from watching the good people behave or act, and but that doesn't tell you what is good and what is bad. Just watching people act, it seems like there would be things that you liked that people did and things that you didn't like, and then there would seem to be you, right, your actions. And it seems like if you the things you liked and the things you didn't like wouldn't necessarily be based on some virtue, but it may be based on your self-interest. And if that's where we're starting from, then how would I look at my moral system will be contradictory. When I acted in my own self-interest, I would think that was a good thing. But when others acted in their own self-interest, which if it affected my own self-interest, I would think that was a bad thing. So self-interest would be in itself both good and bad within the same situation. So what would be good? Would it be the person who acted within the self-interest of others? Uh, but if I don't think that's good, because I think it's good when I act in my own self-interest, uh, it seems like you already have to have a moral code to view some action as virtuous, which is kind of it defeats Dr. Peterson's view, because uh, if you need this moral code in order to build up this system of principles, then you haven't built them up to begin with. You already start with them. And seems like that's maybe a challenge to Dr. Peterson's view on this matter. Secondly, he says virtue is observed within individuals and abstracted. So we just discussed that. Let's listen to him some more.
body of law, right? There's a principle inside that that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that You're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say, we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So, as for example, very briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins. But that's not so good, because, well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space. But from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them. And you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B. And then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too. And so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names, at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive. And you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract that covers both of us if we can do it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Marduk, I'll just give you a couple of his features, but he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god. So
It's interesting he brings up Marduk. That's a guy. That's a god who appears within the biblical scriptures, where the Israelites are said to have sacrificed their children to Marduk. No, I think that's Moloch, but Marduk was seems to be mentioned in the scripture as well. I think he was one of the Syrian gods. So again, it's interesting because this idea that you build up from abstractions and you create God, it would seem to imply that science was a type of God, according to Jordan Peterson's uh, view, because science asks the question of what are things made of, what are the processes within the world, and it seems like it would be this abstraction upon abstraction. You make an observation and you abstract a certain principle, and those principles are a body of scientific principles, which a body of ethical principles he's calling God. But it would seem to be the same case with a body of scientific principles, so that science would be God to him, and this is it would lead to some type of divine scientism, that God is not only the science, but God is what the guiding, that we created God, that we are God of God, we're the God of God, we're the creators of God, which which is an implication of Dr. Peterson's view, which seems a little bit absurd, but we'll continue.
that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster, and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out, and when he fights this deity called Tiamat, And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, Tehom. And Tehom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic. It's a classic St. George story to go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And that's the world that human beings live in. And the Mesopotamian emperor acted out Marduk. He was allowed to be emperor insofar as he was a good Marduk. And so that meant that he had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic. He could speak properly. And so that we're starting to understand there at that point the essence of leadership, right? Because what's leadership? It's the capacity to see what the hell's in front of your face. And
Okay, this is very interesting what Dr. Peterson just mentioned. This is pretty exciting. Marduk apparently has eyes all around his head, and Marduk destroys a sea dragon. But there are verses in the Bible that talks about Taylor, which he says is the same word that is in Genesis uh, when God created the universe from nothing. But it's interesting because the angels who surround God's throne, I think they're seraphim. If not seraphim, something else. I will look it up later. But these angels, they are said to have eyes all around their heads, and they're said to be like beasts and stuff, that they carry the throne of God. I wonder if there's a connection here to say that these beings that the Mesopotamians considered to be gods were actually servants of the true God that they worship. This is interesting because it shows that the Israelites would have taken these ideas from their environment, or been influenced by them, or whatever, or had revelation that these things did actually exist, but that they were not gods, they were servants of the true God. So I think that's pretty interesting. Now, secondly, the Red Sea within the Bible, it's David mentions about you cut Rahab into pieces, and said that this was God who destroyed this watery beast, which a lot of the Bible writers seem to make Rahab the sea serpent that was at the Red Sea when they split the Red Sea. So I guess that was the cutting, like God cut them into pieces, and David said that this was you, said that there was God that did it. Uh, so apparently, again, taking something from the culture and saying, no, that wasn't your God, that was our God who did that. So I think that's something powerful to be said about that. Let's continue.
maybe in every direction, and then the capacity to use your language properly in a transformative manner and to transform chaos into order. And God only knows how long it took the Mesopotamians to figure that out, and the best they could do is dramatize it, but it's staggeringly brilliant. You know, it's by no means obvious, and this chaos is a very strange thing, and this is the chaos that God wrestled with at the beginning of time. Chaos is it's half psychological and half real. There's no other way to really describe it. The chaos is what you encounter when you're thrown into deep confusion, right? When your world falls apart, when you encounter something that blows you into pieces, when your dreams die, when you're betrayed. It's the chaos that emerges, and the chaos is everything at once, and it's too much for you, and that's for sure. And it pulls you down into the underworld, and all that's where the dragons are, and all you've got at that point is your capacity to bloody well keep your eyes open and to speak as carefully and clearly as you can. And maybe if you're lucky, you'll get through it that way and come out the other side. And it's taken people a very long time to figure that out. And it looks to me like the idea is erected on the platform of our ancient ancestors, maybe tens of millions of years ago, because we seem to represent that which disturbs us deeply, using the same system that we use to represent like serpentile serpentine or other carnivorous predators. And we're biological creatures, right? So when we've formulated our capacity to abstract, our strange capacity to abstract and use language, we still have all those underlying systems that were there when we were only animals. And we have to use those systems. They're part of the emotional and motivational architecture of our thinking. Part of the
So he's saying that these abstractions are the results of us developing from a point when we were only animals. So, what are we, Dr. Peterson? What are we? If we're not animals, what are we? Are we more than animals now? How does he explain that? So he's saying that he sees a psychological principle of of being confused or overwhelmed when you experience evil or a deep confusion. And if you can just speak clearly, you may be able to come out of this state. But so he says that this chaos is both psychological and something else, and he is very difficult to articulate what it is. I think he's reading into it the psychological component of chaos. It seems clear that in Genesis that it's not about psychology at all. It's about like the creation of the world. Uh, I mean, you can use it metaphorically to support a psychological principle, like you can use metaphor to support or illuminate or articulate any other principle. But it seems to me that what he's actually doing here is rather using the scripture uh, analogously to his psychological understanding of trauma or confusion or depression or whatever emotional state he's trying to explain here. Let's continue.
reason we can demonize our enemies who upset our axioms is because we perceive them as if they're carnivorous predators. We do it with the same system. And that's chaos itself, the thing that always threatens us, right? The snakes that came to the trees when we lived in them like 60 million years ago. It's the same damn systems. So the Marduk story is partly the story of using attention and language to confront those things that most threaten us. And some of those things are real world threats, but some of them are psychological threats, which are just as profound but far more abstract. But we use the same systems to represent them. It's why you freeze if you're frightened, right? You're a prey animal. You're like a rabbit. You've seen something that's going to eat you. You freeze, and that way you're paralyzed. You're turned to stone, which is what you do when you see a Medusa with a head full of snakes, right? You're turned to stone. You're paralyzed. And the reason you do that is because you're using the predator detection system to protect yourself. Your heart rate goes way up and you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes, and get your speech organized, and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's
So let's recap. He said a lot within this 30 minutes or so of however long we've watched this video. So he basically says we make observations about, so why is the Bible significant? Why is it psychologically significant? This is what I believe Dr. Peterson is saying here, a summary. We make observations as human beings about how other human beings behave, and we try to infer how we ought to behave from those things. We represent human action and human activity and human nature within forms of art, and those art forms become abstractions. It's a way of us taking life and making it more impactful in terms of its dramatic effect, its entertainment uh, value, and the like. And so from these abstractions, we begin to abstract the abstractions themselves. We abstract from art forms. We take certain themes and archetypes and narrative patterns, and we begin to use them over and over again, and distill from those narrative patterns even more basic narrative patterns and the like. This is what he believes the Bible is. It's a document. It's a text filled with uh, abstractions about what humans should do and how humans are and what we do in the world, how we ought to behave, et cetera, et cetera. He thinks that God is like a, a principle, an ideal that we say that can guide action, and that that's what that the Israelites meant by God, which he doesn't suggest. Ultimately, he thinks that the information in dreams, which is a very important question, comes from the stories that we tell. What is this evidence of that? I don't know, but who's telling these stories? It seems to be that some kind of way these stories, by telling them over the human history through writing and literature and art, that they're being retained in within us some kind of way. Maybe was suggesting this when he says that some things, some knowledge is built into our body, such as dance, etc. So I guess he wants to say that these stories are built into our body as we tell them over and over again. And this is what the dreamlike state is, that we regurgitate this information because it's genetic or something like that. But yeah, he doesn't really clearly or explicitly make the connection. But there you have it for tonight. I just want to say thank you for tuning in. If you watched this a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes or 30 minutes to an hour, I really appreciate you stopping by. Thanks. I hope you can visit us again. We're going to continue this series until we complete it. I got a little interest in it, and so we'll continue it. But thank you for watching. My name is Sean Mixon. I'm the Thought Dakota Director of Reasonable Faith Dallas. And always remember to, let me hit this button right when I say it, think better. Have a good one.